Hi guys. So now things start to get really interesting. We're going to talk about vertical separation of concern. I'm going to hide my camera out of the way here so we can make sure I don't cut off any of the slides this time. Now, when we come to implement our example microservice, we will break the project up into 3 sub-projects. It's very similar to a 3-tiered approach to software development, where you would have your presentation layer, your business logic layer, and you would have your data access layer. I term these slightly differently here, but it's the same thing. We have an exposed interface, which is our presentation, if you will. That is our REST API. That is our contract with the rest of the world. We have our domain logic project, which has our processes and validations in there. And we have our data retrieval and persistence project, which really is just around how do we store and persist data and how do we get hold of that data in the future when we need it again. One thing I would note here is if we need to make a communication to another microservice, that would typically be within the infrastructure layer. It is just another data source we need to pull information from. A point I'll make about the domain logic, and we will definitely cover this in detail when we get to writing code. The domain logic is what's called a POCO, a plain old CLR object. That means that by following solid principles, they are plain .NET object classes, class definitions. You should not see any references to specific technologies within there. It is purely just a library full of class definitions. Now, if we look at this from a dependency perspective, the REST API is going to be dependent on the domain logic. It needs to know what the business objects are that we're going to be serving and we're going to be processing. And in the same way, the infrastructure, how do we know what to store unless we are looking at that business domain objects? We need to know what each of our data persisted objects looks like. And then we also have this dependency from our REST API on the infrastructure. That is because as part of that API, we're going to pull from our business objects, we're going to process some things, and then we're going to ask the infrastructure to actually undertake that persistence process for us. Now, the important thing here is that the domain logic does not depend on either one of the other projects. And that supports what I just said before about, the domain logic is plain class definitions and does not have any other dependencies on a particular technology. Now let's try and talk through this, make this a bit more illuminating. I'm going to cover a particular pattern in the future lessons where we're going to look at the repository pattern. But I'm going to cover that briefly now just to illustrate what we mean here. So if you imagine in our infrastructure project, we have a repository class. We have several of them, and they deal with how we get, insert, update, remove data. And in my example here, I kind of said, well, maybe one of those repositories is for Entity Framework Core. So we are reading and writing from a SQL database. Or maybe another repository is actually for data that lives elsewhere, where we have to call another API in order for us to, retrieve or to push data to somewhere else. So our repository class could implement either one of these, or both, I should say. Now, in our domain logic, we will define an iRepository class, not a class, an interface. So there will be no implementation in that interface. Again, we have no dependencies, so we can't reference Entity Framework Core or web APIs or anything like that. But we can say that there should be an implementation of getting data, inserting data, updating data, and removing data. Now, in our API project, we will bring those two things together. We will union them together. We will say that when our microservice starts up, if the domain logic wants to execute the get, add, update, remove calls for that particular interface, we will tell it, or we will tell the runtime that our infrastructure repository class is the implementation of that. And that is the materialized code that actually interacts with the database or other microservices. Okay. Now, this is a level of separation of concern within our application that definitely matches solid principles. And let me give you an example why this is so good. So say we come along and we say, okay, we don't want to be using Entity Framework anymore. We want to move away from that. We actually want to use Azure Cosmos DB. We're moving to a NoSQL type approach. How do we embed that into our microservice? Well, if we didn't have this separation of concern between the projects, we may find a lot of spaghetti code we need to go in, update how we interact with our data. Whereas by following this repository pattern across our separation of projects, all I need to do is create a repository class that implements our iRepository pattern and performs a get, insert, update, remove against an Azure Cosmos DB. And then we can very easily in our REST API runtime, at runtime, we can tell it to, instead of using the entity framework implementation of the repository, we can tell it to use the Cosmos DB implementation. And in exactly the same way, we may change how we want to communicate with other microservices. So we switch out from normal RESTful API and instead we go to use the new Google RPC or gRPC to be politically correct there. We follow that same pattern. We just implement a new repository class and we write the functions to be able to address gRPC instead. So let's just look at separation of concern benefits within, this is what I term the vertical separation of concern, and it is within our single microservice. Well, by breaking it out in this way, it's going to give us an improvement in the code adherence to solid principles in general. And that's always a good thing just for maintainability. You can Google that and you will find a solid thumbs up for following solid principles, pun intended there. You will see a reduction in code complexity. Initially, it may feel by having these interfaces that maybe we're making it more complex than it needs to be, but actually we are separating out concern and responsibilities. When I'm dealing with my business logic within my domain layer, I am saying I want to add a record, delete a record, I want to get records. I'm not confusing myself with what that actually looks like. Which database do I need to connect to, or how does the SQL statement need to be formed, or how should the join operation be performed? They are things that instead would live in the infrastructure layer. And when I'm looking at that infrastructure layer, I'm not concerning myself with how the business logic maybe would normally influence me. So there is no influence there, which is actually a great thing. The other thing we spoke about is I can replace that infrastructure layer without rewriting the business logic or the REST API. So we've written a fantastic microservice. We have hundreds of these microservices. They run our business. The oldest one now is using a technology that is vastly out of date. The maintenance of the back-end infrastructure for that is very costly, and we would like to switch it for more modern technology, whatever that may be in the future. Well, because of this separation of concern within the microservice, we can rewrite our repository implementation, and we don't have to have so much concern about breaking the whole application. Of course, you will still test it and make sure everything's still good. It's not really that seamless and perfect, but it definitely reduces the challenge and the size of that scope of work to replace a whole infrastructure technology. Exactly the same applies for REST API. So we looked at an example where in our infrastructure layer, we said, what if we were to use RPC instead of RESTful API? Well, let's look at our presentation layer. What if we wanted to switch out our RESTful API and instead we wanted to serve using the gRPC protocols? The same thing applies. We can just rewrite that one layer that is going to deal with the call signatures. But in terms of the code they call, the domain logic that they call, and the persistence methods that they call, they will be exactly the same. The final thing that it gives us as a benefit is that if we update or change our business logic code, it is uncluttered by the infrastructure layer implementations. Indeed, it's uncluttered from the REST API as well. So what we mean by that is if I wanted to change some of my business logic, so instead of A plus B equals C, I wanted to say A plus B equals D. That's how I am writing that code. I'm not concerned about where A comes from or where B comes from. I'm not concerned about where I write the value D2. That is all handled in the infrastructure layer. So again, reiterating our separation of concern, even within our microservice, our presentation layer, our API layer, our domain layer, and our infrastructure layer. For each one of those layers, they need to do their job well, do it consistently, and do it reliably.